followed me on Instagram, and like I looked at her pictures, and she was a trapeze artist, and I was like, ooh. And the fact that she was really attractive didn't hurt, but I went because I was curious, and I was like, "Oh, you're a trapeze artist for Cirque du Soleil." I'm like, "Well, that would be a fucking fascinating interview." And so I made a note and said, "Okay, you know what?" I reminded myself, like, when I get.
This is Scratch Your Own Itch, the one show that delivers the conversations that we're afraid to share, but need to. This show is all about creating a life worth living. I'm Logan Tyler Nelson, and I'm your host. So, you're going to hear conversations with creators and entrepreneurs talk about what they do, their current and past traumas, how they became who they are, and what they are truly curious about. This is the show where we talk about the things we think about a lot, but need to talk about more. Please take note that this show is not a substitute for actually creating a life worth living, because this show will stir your beliefs, make you question what it means to create a life worth living. So my promise to you is to always give you one question to answer for yourself today to start turning your dreams into a reality. So, my curiosity question for you is, what are you obsessed with? Okay, let me set the tone. Following your dreams is a very romantic idea until you start, doing it. When it's just a far off possibility, when it's just a maybe someday kind of idea that lives in your brain, it's much more appealing because that version of following your dream is the highlight reel. It's your consciously or unconsciously imagining of this dream achievement montage that plays in your head, in which you're writing in your head, it seems a lot of fun, right? But actually doing it. Now that's a whole different ball game. That's where it becomes sort of unromantic. That version of your dreams inside your head is hard to actually put into existence. And if any of this is resonating with you, then you're in for a treat, because my guest is someone who takes his obsessions of ideas in his head and makes them a reality. His name is Srini Rao, and he is the host and founder of the Unmistakable Creative podcast, where he has interviewed more than 700 people ranging from bank robbers to billionaires. Guests have included Daniel Laporte, Glenn Beck, Tim Ferriss, Ella Luna, Seth Godin, and hundreds of others. His self-published book, The Art of Being Unmistakable, was a Wall Street Journal bestseller, and his most recent book, The Audience of One. So, without further ado, give a huge warm welcome to the one and only Srini Rao.
Hey there. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Srini. Man, thanks a lot for coming on, man. Honestly, like I was telling you off air, I've listened to thousands of hours of your podcast. It's probably just as important to me to listen to that podcast as it was to go to class at school during my university years. It was actually more important to listen to that podcast. So I just appreciate your huge, I just got to acknowledge you right off the bat, your huge skill of interviewing people is it's seriously like, it's hard to compete with you. Like Jordan Harbinger, all those guys, you're up there. Larry King, Oprah Winfrey, I put you on the same field as them.
Oh, thank you. That's very flattering.
Well, dude, you've earned it. All right. So the mission of the show is called Scratch Your Own Itch, which to me is sort of like you're finding clarity by actually scratching your own itch. And so maybe that itch is writing for you. Maybe that itch is you found some problem that you had with yourself, and by doing so, you found a way to systematize it. So where did you sort of start finally scratching that itch, and how did it get you to where you are today?
It's interesting because I think that there was little inklings of it throughout my life. I wrote a 63-page single-spaced autobiography about my 4 years in college in 8 days. I tinkered with blogs the moment Blogger came out. And then it really, I think, started to take hold back in 2009 when the gap between creativity and technology had become narrower, and I could execute most of my ideas without the technical skills that used to be necessary. And so suddenly I found myself in this just sort of unusual position in which I could do things I couldn't do before. I was able to start a blog, and it took very little technical skill to do it. And so that was really the beginning. That kind of planted the seed for almost everything that I've done since 2009. The blog led to the podcast, which subsequently became Unmistakable Creative, which is what you know me for. But prior to being Unmistakable Creative, it was actually called Blogcast FM, a podcast for bloggers. And it just kind of took on a life of its own. And it really kind of evolved over the better part of probably a decade at this point. I mean, it's been a long, long time. I think that people don't realize just how long I've been doing this. And we're kind of an anomaly in the space, in that we started before everybody else, and we have been around longer, and we've grown slower than people who come after us. But I think for me, what has happened more and more over the course of the last probably 10 years is that the gap between creativity and technology has become narrower and narrower, to the point where it's going to soon be non-existent. And we're getting closer and closer to that. And that's exciting. That's exciting because it's going to put a lot of power in the hands of people who have creative ideas. Hell, I mean, it already has, but it also does something else. It raises the bar for you to be able to stand out in a sea of noise. And we've just reached this sort of interesting inflection point in society where the sheer volume of information that is competing for our attention is insane. It's far beyond what evolution ever intended. And so as a result, we don't really go deep with a lot of things, and we have sort of shallow focus on a dozens of things as opposed to deep focus on a handful of things. And I think I have always kind of fallen into the camp of, okay, I want to work on a handful of things and go really deep with them.
Yeah, that's what I see in your work time and time again is you really like to. I think that's why your hour-long show could never be like a quick 15-minute or like.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely not. It is the default. One of the rules that we have is if you won't give us an hour, we don't give a shit how famous you are. If Oprah didn't give us an hour, we would say no.
Yeah. Wow. I love it. I love that sort of sticking to your guns. And one thing I've really found interesting though about you is, and this is, I guess, like, you can get as transparent as you want, but I can see you getting a little step of ahead of some of your guests, and when they're going down a road of just saying remote answers that are just like already plugged into their minds and they're just habitual with those. How have you been able to kind of like break them out of that habit?
Yeah, that's such a good question. It's funny because I've been working on this new piece titled "The Art of the Interview: What I've Learned from 700 Episodes," and that actually is one of the questions that I wanted to answer, because when you interview people, particularly people who are interviewed a lot or people who have a large public presence or are quote unquote famous in any way, they're used to being interviewed, and more often than not, they're asked the same questions in every single interview. And of course, if you keep getting asked the same questions in every interview, it becomes very easy, like you said, for them to go right into sort of that pattern of, oh, well, okay, I've answered this 1,000 times. This is how I'm going to answer this question. A lot of it comes down to the way that you ask questions. So you've listened to the show, so you know that we start the show with very unusual questions. Everything ranging from what did your parents do to a living to what social group were you a part of in high school to where in the world did you grow up? Because the thing that happens when you ask questions like that is that there's no conditioned response that they can give you because nobody asks them those questions. So the key to what you're talking about, to getting people to that place, is to effectively interrupt patterns. It's what Tony Robbins in the world of personal development calls a pattern interrupt. And when you interrupt a pattern like that, you basically break whatever script that they had in mind, completely stops. So I'll give you an example. You probably remember this since you listen. I remember asking Gay Hendricks, who wrote this book called I don't. He's the Zone of Genius guy. I can't remember the damn name of the book, even though it's an amazing book. You'll have to look it up. And The Big Leap. That's what it's
Big
called.
Leap. Yep.
Yeah.
I was going to give you 2 more seconds. And I was like, Big Leap, man. Nice.
Yeah. I mean, when you read as many books as I do, it gets confusing sometimes. Uh, but the thing is, I asked him the question of what social group you are part of in high school. And the funniest thing was I got this entire story from Gay Hendricks about how he didn't have a date for the prom and how he was in the chemistry lab and these 3 really popular girls came up to him and asked him, if he would take their friend because they knew he didn't have a date. Like, there's no way you're going to get that if you ask sort of a standard question. So, I mean, the thing that I realized, and I credit to my business partner, Brian, for this, he said, you're going to get to somebody's work in a conversation because if that's what they're there to talk about, great. But everybody asks them about their work. And the thing is that there's nothing particularly interesting about a conversation in which whatever's said about that person in a conversation is what you could read online by a few Google searches. I don't want a conversation like that. I want a part of a conversation that shows a part of this person that you're not going to be able to get anywhere else. That's going to be so deep and so riveting that you can't help but sit in your driveway and listen. You yourself said it, that you put it, up to next to your actual academic curriculum, which, that makes me really happy considering my views on education. But I think that's by design. We've really gone out of our way to set up the show. So I think part of it is just, redirecting the conversation, asking different questions than people are used to being asked. Easier said than done, I realize, because I've done this for a really long time and I've just developed a unique skill set for it and a style for it. The other thing that I think is really worth noting is that most of my questions are based on what I'm genuinely curious about. Like the opening questions are always planned in advance. But with each one of these people, their questions. So, we just had Cal Fussman. Episode hasn't come out, but I really wanted to know where Cal grew up. And I'd heard him on other interviews and I wanted to make sure that I got something very different from him than what Tim Ferriss got from him. Because I was like, okay, you know what? Tim Ferriss got one story from him. I want to get a very different one. And I did. I mean, the Cal Fussman interview, which you'll hear on Monday, is like a damn history lesson. It's incredible. It sounds like a damn movie when you listen to it. So that's really a big part of it. I wish there was like some exact sort of step-by-step hack to do this, but really it's about practice. It's about listening. It's about doing it over and over and over again. So there are things that I go back and I listen to, and I'll give you an example of this. So a couple of years ago, we interviewed this guy named James Clear, who your listeners have probably heard of. Substantial online footprint, writes about habits, behavioral change, and all that. And he was telling me a story about his senior year in high school and how he had this horrific injury where he got hit in the face with a baseball bat. And I realized the question that I followed that up with was a very logical question. It was kind of like, why do people have post-traumatic stress versus growth? And when I went back and I listened to that question, I thought, well, that's a shitty question, because somebody getting hit in the face with a baseball bat and like being laid out in a hospital, there's a story in and of itself there. And I missed out on it completely. Yeah. I missed out on one of the most important stories in that conversation, even though all of our listeners will say that was a fantastic interview. When I realized that, I was like, that made that a shitty interview. It could have been better if I hadn't done that.
Oh man, wow. So many thoughts are going through my head, but one of them is this sort of like, you brought up the curiosity thing, which is there's a huge strength to being curious in our life, but the pitfalls of being curious, being focused, man. Like, that is the hardest thing. They're like, not changing your podcast. I've noticed, because I've been a huge fan, you don't really change the intro. You haven't really changed the outro. And even your like subscribe or sort of like share this episode, like mini ads, so to speak, aren't really changed at all. How do you just go with what works and sort of systematize it? And also, how do you find that thing that you want to start focusing on, especially a book like yours, Audience of One?
Well, as far as not changing things, we make subtle changes that probably at this point are so subtle you don't notice them. So yeah, you're right. We haven't changed the intro music, which pisses me off because my friend's like, you realize it's like a stock sort of music, right? He said it's kind of the antithesis of everything you stand for. I was like, yeah, fair enough. Like, we recorded that a couple of years ago, just never got around to fixing it. You're right. We haven't changed the way we start or end the show in a really long time. And I don't see any reason to, because it works. I think that there's this weird sort of desire in our culture to constantly keep changing something based on what some figure of authority says, or some guru says, or what some social media celebrity says. Somebody says, oh, do this and you'll have 1 million followers on Instagram. And of course, everybody fucking runs and does it. Or this is another one. I mean, podcasting is a perfect example of this. A couple of years ago, everybody in there was like, oh, everybody should start a podcast. And conveniently, the people who were most vocal about that mantra were the people who also happen to sell courses on how to start a podcast. And I thought that was bullshit. I was like, no, not everybody should start a podcast. And we're seeing the repercussions of that right now. There are people at big brands, when I know this because I emailed some of them for my book launch to say, hey, would you be up for having me back on your show? And most of them replied saying, oh, I'm taking a hiatus from the show. And these are people who are like very successful. Their businesses are thriving. So when that happens, it tells you that what has happened basically is a bandwagon effect, which is not isolated to podcasts. This is something that's happened throughout history. So all that being said, to answer your question of why we don't change things, there are a couple of different things that come to mind here. Ryan Holiday wrote a book called Perennial Seller, which is all about making work that lasts. And it's such a fascinating read, and probably one of the most informative things I've ever really spent a lot of time thinking about. And the idea behind making, what is called a perennial seller, he cites examples throughout history, like Shawshank Redemption, which barely registered at the box office. And funny thing, you hear that and you're kind of like, holy shit, that's so hard to believe, because that movie is so amazing. And yet, and you could probably watch it on TV any weekend, but it didn't become popular until it got to DVD. Now, you could have written it off as a failure and said, okay, well, this thing didn't do well at the box office. Same thing happens to a lot of books as well. If you look at the New York Times bestseller list, the books that have been there for a really long time are often there long after they come out. Sometimes it might be 3 or 4 years after they come out that you actually see the book. And so with the podcast, particularly with Unmistakable Creative, the more I thought about it, the more I felt that I wanted what we were creating to be timeless. So you listen to the podcast, every Friday we put these best of episodes up. And what's funny is some of those conversations are 4 years old. It doesn't make them any less relevant today, because we've designed the show in such a way that it doesn't matter when you listen to the information, you would actually find it valuable.
Hey, Logan Tyler Nelson here. I would so appreciate it if you took some time to hit the subscribe button. I really want to just honestly live and give. Why? Because I was told when I was young that if you're feeling down, the best way to feel better is by lifting someone up again. So in an effort to make someone feel less alone, please hit the subscribe button so the podcast has a better chance of being found and making someone feel less alone. And if you're feeling down, hey, it can help you. Know that by hitting that subscribe button, you just did someone a huge favor. So thank you for hitting that subscribe button. Wow, man. Wow. I love that, because honestly, see, that's why I can listen to your show. And that's actually why I like podcasts overall, is because you actually have to look for the date to actually find it's been published in 2017 and not 18. And I just find that content is just so evergreen. And it's funny that you have even said, though, that you don't listen to podcasts very often. Why do you think you've become a great interviewer, even though you don't consume that art?
That's a really interesting question. Nobody's ever asked it to me that way before, which I appreciate. I've thought about that a lot, right? Because I've even made the argument in my own book that you should consume the art form that you create if you want to get better at it. And yet I don't consume audio. It's not really my preferred form of media consumption. In some ways, I think maybe that has also made me a better interviewer, because I'm not listening to how somebody else does what they do. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't not listen to podcasts at all. Like, I do have the podcast app. I have a few things that I'm subscribed to. If I'm in the car, I will usually listen to I'll usually just turn on a podcast just to see what's going on, because there's never anything good on the radio. I do listen to music sometimes, but podcasts have kind of become my go-to in the car. But in general, if you look at sort of my podcast consumption for somebody who creates a podcast, I don't listen to very many. And that's a really bizarre thing. So as far as why, despite the fact that I don't consume the art form, have I been able to cultivate my craft as an interviewer? I think part of it is because of the fact that I've really, really looked at it as a craft. And when I do listen to podcasts, I don't listen to people who fall into sort of the entrepreneurial sort of, personal development kind of, the people who fall into my own genre pretty much. Who I do listen to are people that are sort of like really, really masters, the people who do NPR type podcasts, because they've figured out something. They've clearly understood how to tell stories in a way that's compelling. This whole narrative journalism effect. I really want to be able to I would love it if I had the skill and the editing capacity to basically create a show similar to what Guy Raz does with How I Built This. I think I have the dialogue, and the dialogue that I pull out of people is there. It's a matter of finding somebody who knows how to edit in that way that would really, I think, get it to that level. I also am always experimenting. We'll try things and sometimes they fall flat. I'm willing to bet on guests that most people are kind of like, maybe nothing here. And I'm kind of like, well, I think there is. There are people. It's funny because there are people who most people would kill to have on their podcast that we have said no to. And then there are people who nobody's ever fucking heard of that we like begged and pleaded to get on our podcast. And that's always been by design, because I knew ultimately, here's the thing, right? Like let's say you land Tim Ferriss for your podcast. People think that this is like the biggest deal in the world. And what they completely overlook is that, Tim Ferriss is also on like 100 other podcasts. So it's not a big deal to land Tim Ferriss on your podcast. It's not going to make you stand out in any way. What makes you stand out is stuff that is interesting, and stuff that is interesting is usually based on your personal curiosity. That's why I would never outsource guest selection either. There are services that do that. And I was like, no, why would I do that? This is like probably the thing that I am most like gifted at is curating people. And then the other part of it, I mentioned craft at the beginning of this sort of rant that I'm on. But I go back and I listen to everything. I listen to everything multiple times. I am very, very mindful of what we create because I believe that attention is an incredibly precious asset. And the fact that people are willing to share theirs with you means a lot to me. And I respect that to the point where I will cut interviews in the middle of them if I don't like how it's going. I will not publish something if I don't like it. And I will ask people to do retakes if I'm not happy with how it turned out. And if somebody, which on occasion they have, tells me to go fuck myself, then I just delete the interview. I'm clear that they're not a guest for Unmistakable Creative. And I'm not interested in supporting mediocrity because of the fact that the moment somebody presses play, I know for a fact they're choosing me out of thousands of other options. I better fucking deliver.
I love that, man. I'm giving you such a virtual like hug right now because I think that's so hard to do nowadays, is to actually tell somebody what they don't want to hear. And it's a practice. And I think that it often happens a lot with artists that I see a rejection and being told no is something that they're able to do. They're able to take the no and the rejection. It's why Howard Stern, it stands out more than 90,000% of interviewers, because he's able to instigate, to poke at things that people clearly don't want to be poked at. And I'm sure you have opinions about that.
I mean, there's this amazing, I don't know if it's a newsletter or it might be on his blog. It's called the Lefsetz Letter. Bob Lefsetz is a music critic, and he actually wrote a piece about Howard Stern that was really good about how Stern has become really successful. I mean, Stern has really mastered his craft, and he's spent, probably the better part of 15, 20 years doing it. And he talked about it on the interview that he did with David Letterman. And you see that, and it's mind blowing.
It really is. It really, really is. Sometimes I put you on mute just to make sure that I hear all of it. So one thing though I want to go into is scratching the surface curiosity questions, which is just sort of like some little deep questions and then some sort of scratching the surface, exactly what they sound like questions. So the first question, I want to ask you this, like,
Mm.
Srini, what do you think you for yourself, like what desires do you think you're fulfilling for yourself versus desires of other people around you just based off of your influences?
Well, it's a good question, and it's a fitting question given the subject matter of this book. I think that the desire that I'm fulfilling for myself is to explore my personal interests through my work. Um, every choice that I make about who to talk to is based on my own personal curiosity. I just look at a story and I'm like, oh, there's something interesting here. I'll give you an example. The other day, somebody followed me on Instagram, and like I looked at her pictures, and she was a trapeze artist, and I was like, ooh. And the fact that she was really attractive didn't hurt, uh, but I went and looked because I was curious, and I was like, "Oh, you're a trapeze artist for Cirque du Soleil." I'm like, "Well, that would be a fucking fascinating interview." And so I made a note and said, "Okay, you know what?" I reminded myself, like, when I get a chance, reach out to this person. And the funny thing is, most people wouldn't have looked at this random person who followed them on Instagram and said, "Huh, I wonder if there's an interview here." My first thought was, "Ooh, trapeze artist from Cirque du Soleil. Like, who the hell? Like, there's no way that's not going to be a fascinating conversation." Uh, because for somebody to do that as a living is so out of the sort of norm of society and our scripts. So that's really, I think, what drives me. I think the other part of this is that I have this perpetual desire to be creating something. I need to be creating something. If I'm not happy. The worst times in my life are always when I'm not working on something. It's weird. I don't have an easy time. This is something that I struggle with. I don't have an easy time doing nothing, or just spending time alone, or like, if I have something to work on, it occupies me. I think it consumes my attention, and when I don't, my mind just kind of goes in circles, and like I tend to be super ADD and anxiety ridden. But when I have something that I know, like, okay, this is my focus for the next like 8 to 9 months or next year, then it's all consuming, and I like it that way. Somebody asked me recently, they're like, "How does it feel to be done with a book?" And I said, "I hate being done with a book. Like, I can't stand being done with a book." Like, by the time you, like, right after you submit the manuscript, you're like, "Thank fucking God this thing is over." Then you kind of wake up a few days later and you're like, shit, now I just want to be in the middle of it. That's my favorite part. I genuinely enjoy the process. I like writing books. I want to keep writing books. Somebody asked me, what's your goal with books? And I said, to be honest, I want, if I'm lucky, what my goal that I'll be able to reach through my books is to write more books.
It's funny because I was literally going to ask you this question of what you're struggling with, and you already answered it. Like, but it's crazy because it's a paradox that we live in. We think that the sort of like having the book done is going to give us, everything we want, or having, 500 episodes in the can to
Mm.
now like share with everyone is what we want. And then we think, oh, that business, that $1 million business that we want is going to finally give us the life that we want. And I
Mm.
have to pay respects where respects are earned. And I've learned that from your show, listening to the show, that the process is the most important part. Finding the problem that you're allowing yourself to really take into like interviewing for me is a process that I love doing, even though sometimes it's a little nerve wracking. Like, I mean, you could really mess up. You could also have a terrible interview, and not ask good questions, and so, or even having a business, like working on that business, and to be open about it and to make content around it, is way more enjoyable than actually hitting publish on it for some reason.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
But I do need to ask you this because I think it's like, it's definitely a question that I just like, all right, what kind of question? What's something like a belief that you had about some subject, if 5 years ago, that now you look at it and you go, wow, that was so unbelievably false.
5 years ago, I might be, believe it or not, the point that I was into this project. But if we were to go back to probably, I think 2009 or 2007, when I started business school, I had a very set and narrow definition of what success looked like. It was a certain type of job with a certain type of salary, that was prestigious in some way and respected in some way. And that was the measure. And the funny thing about that measure of success is that it was all based on the opinions of other people. which is a recipe for disaster. And hence the reason, I think that my career has been a series of ups and downs, largely because I've often made decisions, particularly earlier in my life, based on how I thought other people would respond, or whether or not other people would approve. Like when your definition of success is based on other people's opinions, it's ludicrous because you're making decisions about your life based on people's opinions, and those people will never have to live with the consequences of your choices.
Amazing, dude. Seriously. And yeah, I think that's the most important question for anyone to answer is what's your own definition of success? Like and it really does sometimes change and evolve. So that's okay. But to try to take and carbon copy anyone else's definition is it's just not practical, because guess what? Then if you do that, you have to trade your entire life with them. And that's just not possible. So I want to go into these 30 seconds or less type questions and answers. Sure. So this is going to be a fun one for you. If you could sit down with one person on a bench for an entire hour, who would it be and why?
Oof. Wow.
Hey, Logan Tyler Nelson here. I would so appreciate it if you took some time to hit the subscribe button. I really want to just honestly live and give. Why? Because I was told when I was young that if you're feeling down, the best way to feel better is by lifting someone up again. So in an effort to make someone feel less alone, please hit the subscribe button so the podcast has a better chance of being found and making someone feel less alone. And if you're feeling down, hey, it can help you. Know that by hitting that subscribe button, you just did someone a huge favor. So thank you for hitting that subscribe button.
Jeez, it's so funny because there's numerous people that come to mind. I mean, world leaders are a starting point. At the moment, there are probably two people, and it's funny enough that they happen to be comedians. Probably John Oliver or Trevor Noah. Trevor Noah, because I would really like to understand how I think what's special about Trevor Noah is that he had to fill some really fucking big shoes to step into the role that he did. That's not an easy position to be in, and he's kind of come into his own. In some way, my joke is that the Trump presidency is probably the best thing that ever happened to Trevor Noah, because he's gotten endless amounts of material. There's just so much to cover every day that there's no end to it. But I remember thinking, is this guy going to find his own? And really, because when you follow in the footsteps of an iconic character like Jon Stewart, not only you have big shoes to fill, at the same time, you have to become your own person. Trevor Noah is not Jon Stewart, and he's not supposed to be. And I think it's remarkable that he's found his own voice. The other person I think would be John Oliver. My guess is if John Oliver didn't get the offer from HBO, he would have gotten the job at Comedy Central instead of Trevor Noah. I don't know if that's true, but I think it might be, because if John Oliver was poached by HBO, there's a good chance that Comedy Central had to be thinking about him. And John Oliver is brilliant because he, in 18 minutes, packs in so much information. He teaches us something. He makes us laugh. And he's smart. He's super smart. Like I want to know, what does a guy like this read? How does he keep up with all this shit? And how does the process of putting together an episode of Last Week Tonight work? Like, what's the creative process? Like, how many people are involved in coming up with these bits? And how long does it take to write something that's that smart but only lasts 18 minutes? I think to me, anybody who can do brilliant things and create brilliant work with incredible constraints is a genius. Like that is a level of sort of depth and brilliance that I aspire to achieve in my life.
I love it, dude. I love how you've taken art and entertainment and used that as valuable, and just as valuable as like what you read in technology and stuff that's going to like level you up, for example. But it's this sort of like being entertained and analyzing the way Trevor Noah does his comedy. It does give an exemplary context of why I think you actually are a good artist, is because, or a great interviewer, which I think is very much art indeed, is because of the way you're able to look at it from many angles instead of just one. But yeah, I mean, I could go on for that. I'm trying to make these 30 seconds or less. Srini, you're throwing me off my game. But the next question I really want to ask you is, if you could recommend one podcast for someone to listen to. Shameless plug. I know you're unmistakably creative as one, but what's another one?
Who I think is an incredible interviewer, and it's not surprising that Netflix picked him up and made a TV show out of this, is Sam Jones, who runs a show called Off Camera. He interviews the most brilliant people, like Matt Damon, Laird Hamilton. The fact that he can, get a dialogue that goes across such a wide range of people. I mean, when you can have a conversation with Cindy Crawford, Laird Hamilton, Tony Hawk, and Matt Damon all in the same podcast, that's a whole other level of genius. He's a celebrity photographer, and I think his work is absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, no, he's up there. I compare him to Joe Rogan a lot. I think Joe Rogan has it a little bit easier because he does 2 hours and 40 minutes sometimes. Yeah. And you can get pretty deep with someone in 2 hours and 40 minutes. So, totally. But yeah, I totally agree 100%. If you could switch out with one person in their career field, what career field would that be?
Oof. So it's like saying, what job would I want to do for a day? To be honest, at the moment, I would like the job of the president because I think I could do it better.
Oh, nice.
Which doesn't say much, to be honest. No, I mean, in all honesty, like when I look at those jobs, I'm like, oh, okay, that would be cool to be like, the most powerful person in the world for a day. I'm trying to think of who else has like a job that's just a shit ton of fun. I'm trying to think of who I would want to be. Whose job I would love for just a week is Dave Matthews.
Ooh, I thought you were going to say Casey Neistat.
No, I would love to switch places with Dave Matthews for a week, to be able to just get on a fucking stage and like rock it.
Oh man, you would. I think you'd kill it. Actually, that's awesome. It's cool because maybe someone doesn't know this, but if you know Srini, he comes from a music background, so yes. he would rock it. I agree with that. What is a glimpse of your morning routine, man? And I got just a couple more questions. We'll round it out.
Yeah, no worries. So morning routine is pretty standard at this point. I wake up in the morning like 5:30 or 6 o'clock, depending on what I did the night before. Sometimes if I've smoked a joint the night before, it's, pushed to 6:30. But usually it's 6 a.m., wake up, brush your teeth, coffee is set to brew. And then while the coffee is brewing, I meditate for, 10 to 15 minutes. And after the meditation is done, I sit down and I go and get the coffee after the meditation is done, and I read for anywhere between 30 to 45 minutes. I try to average about 50 to 75 pages of reading every morning, depending on what's going on. Then I will write by hand in a journal for probably 30 minutes or so. I go until I hit 3 pages. Like that's the Julia Cameron sort of morning pages routine, but I don't stop there. So when I open up my computer, the goal is then, because you can't, track your word count on a Moleskine, but you can on your computer. So then I open up a distraction-free writing app, and I'll write until I hit 1,000 words. Sometimes I'll get to 1,500. It just really depends on the morning. And then, so I try to eliminate as many decisions as possible from the first part of my day. Like I try to automate a good amount of that. And then really depending on what the day looks like, interviews happen between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. If there are no interviews, I try to get in a workout. So I just recently started doing CrossFit at the recommendation of a friend. The afternoons I struggle with because I feel this constant need to be doing something, even though I'm not doing anything particularly important in the afternoons. I'd be better off just shutting down completely at like 2 or 3. But overall, that's the gist of it. And I think the thing that people don't realize when it comes to routines is that the environment and the behavior will eventually get linked at a certain point. So I don't have to think about doing this stuff anymore, only because I've done it so much.
So true, man. So true. I'm the same way. It's funny. I get connected with podcasters and I go, that's why they are the way they are. It's not because of their parents all the time. It's because of the habits that they've created during this moment in their life. And so look at someone's habits and look at their lifestyle, and you will see a very, very funny correlation with that.
Oh yeah, totally.
So yeah, just two more questions. Question is, where's one place people can find you, Srini?
Well, the book Audience of One is available on Amazon, and then the other place is in iTunes. Just do a search for Unmistakable Creative.
Nice. I'll put in the direct link to Audience of One in the show notes. So anyone that's got an Apple or Overcast or whichever way you're actually listening to this and consuming it. I mean, if you're listening to this on a computer, I would say, wow. I can't believe you are. That's amazing.
There are people who do, though.
It's crazy. But you will be able to click on that link and find the direct link to his book. It's a very, very well-written book, and it is exactly what I think every single person that wants to just up their game in creativity, up their game in being able to think in a way where, oh, I've got a business, but I need to stand out with my business because I have a lot of competition. This book can help you. If you're someone who's also had a real hard problem with writing overall, I think this book is great for that. So I just got to say that off the bat.
Sweet. Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been fun.
Oh, dude, you're so welcome. But I want to leave this off where someone can be kind of musing too, because I think self-inquisitive questions are sometimes more important than answers. So what's a question that you can leave our audience with that'll sort of like, leave them trying to tackle during their time and their life on this planet?
Yeah. It's funny. It's such a fitting ending to the question, because the answer that was coming to mind, it's almost like you read my mind. What I would say is, what are the souvenirs that, or the things that you can leave behind that have been a representation of the fact that you're here?
Man, that is, wow. We didn't set that up, Srini. This is totally improvised, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. That's huge. Wow. Well, Srini, thank you so much for being on the show, man. I will honestly love to have you on, like maybe in a couple of months, and just see where you're at, and also maybe talk about, I think, a real value for people that are interested in making more creative work, stand in their business, is sort of like come out and go, hey, this is what it is to actually go on a bunch of interviews and to publish a book and market it. And to go through like maybe your system of doing it. I think that could be valuable for people.
For sure. Yeah. I'm actually working on a lengthy piece about this that will be probably coming out next week sometime. So I'll share it with you when it goes live.
Sweet. I'm moving over LinkedIn too. That's where it's at, my friends. Go there. Sweet. All right. End it out. Oh, wow. You made it to the very end of the show. Thank you so much for tuning in for another episode of Scratch Your Own Itch with your host, Logan Tyler Nelson. To make it to the end, gosh, that doesn't happen very much nowadays. I mean, especially with the constant distraction. So I appreciate all of the efforts that you just took out of your day to make it to the end. And if you hit that subscribe button and leave a review, you would have no idea what that would mean to me. So thank you so much for taking the time to hit that subscribe button. And if you leave a review, check it out. Just screenshot it, send it to me, and I'd love to host your review out on the show. But don't ever forget, like I say, you matter and you're enough.
Love is the main reason for how all this happened. Love for all my fans, love for all the shows. Got love for all my memories, no matter where I go. Even if I'm out to nothing, I know there's always something. It's not a fitness test, but it'll always